Christians, continuing in my mini-series that I call Make Egypt Great Again. We see the new king that replaced Pharaoh, the Pharaoh that was in charge when Joseph was second in command. This new king, who did not know Joseph, had a plan to make Egypt great again. And as I have said in the previous post, the plan was to stop the growth of Israel, the Israelites, to stifle their energy, to crush their will, to limit their ability to procreate and increase in numbers, and basically to overall do whatever he can to make them subservient to the state. Now, many people consider them to be put into situations where they were slaves, but they were not chattel slaves. They were not slaves the way slavery was and the way slaves were in America. It was very different. Back then, Israel, under this new king, and when they were in Egypt, when Joseph brought them over, they had their own homes. They had their own city that they were relegated to. They had their own places where they could raise their families and tend to their sheep and their livestock. They had homes. And this new king didn't take that away from them. So they were able to do the work that the new king imposed upon them, but they would also be able to go home. Now, but it would be a time of grievous turmoil and persecution and affliction for them. But nonetheless, they weren't like slaves the way we know slaves to be, the way it was in America. It was very different. But it says here that this new king set taskmasters over the Israelites. And I explained that the taskmasters, they were really tax gatherers. They were tax gatherers, and they were, what their role was to do was to create the means whereby, meaning they would increase burdens. They would create burdens that they would put on Israel that was impossible for them to make payment on. So they would pay tribute. They would pay taxes. So Egypt would create an impossible burden for them to do, tax them on it, and then increase their taxes up, based on their inability to deliver or their inability to deliver the full tale of what it was they were expected to build. So the whole goal was to break them and to impoverish them and to make them subservient to the state. So we see in verse 11 that they set up these taskmasters over them, the Egyptians did, to afflict the Israelites with these onerous burdens. And it says that they built for Pharaoh, the Egyptians that is, they built for Pharaoh supply cities. And these supply cities, one was called Pithom, one was called Ramesses. We see this in Exodus chapter 1, verse 11. And it says that in verse 12, that the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were in dread of the children of Israel. But let's go back for a second and deal with what we see here in verse 11 going into verse 12. So these cities, these supply cities, or what has been known as store cities, these were built. And the whole idea was to take the whole male population of the Israelites and then sell them off into companies, and they would be employed day and night under the Egyptian tax gatherers or the taskmasters, same thing. Now, what would happen is they would attend upon public works, driving cattle in the fields, digging clay, and making bricks, and they would be bearing burdens, building cities, and essentially, as I said previously, they would be subjected to creating to burdens that would make it impossible for them to ever come out from under. And the whole goal of this was for the Pharaoh to have justification to subjugate the Israelites to the most severe of cruelties. And this is what they did. So these cities were also called cities of store. So these supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, these were supply cities or store cities, places where they would accumulate the food and corn and whatever it is they were accumulating that can be sold, and that would increase the wealth of the government of Egypt. For example, in 2 Chronicles 16 verse 4, we read this: "And Benhadad hearkened unto King Asa, and he sent captains of his armies against the cities of Israel. And they smote Ihon and Dan and Albemarle and all the store cities of Naphtali." Store cities were places where goods were stored, like Fort Knox. Stuff would be stored there for future use and to be sold. 2 Chronicles 17 verse 12 says this: "And Jehoshaphat waxed great exceedingly, and he built in Judah castles and cities of store." Again, cities of store were great reservoirs where resources were maintained that had value, and it would increase the wealth of the state. We see this again in Luke 12, verse 16 and 17. "And he spoke a parable unto them," Jesus did, "the ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do? Because I have no room to bestow my fruits." And in verse 18, he said, "This is what I'll do. I will pull down my barns and build greater ones. And there will I bestow all my fruits and all my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have much goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." Luke 12:20. "But God said unto them, You fool, this night thy soul shall be required of you. Then whose shall those things be which you have provided?" So we see that store cities or supply cities were these areas that were designated to build up and to accumulate and to amass great measures of wealth from products that were built and made on the backs of the Israelites. And this is what Pharaoh, this new king, was doing in order to make Egypt great again. And we see that in Exodus 1:13, it says, "So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor." Serve with rigor. So there, I will stop here in this part here, part 8, and I will pick up in the next post with part 9 of Make Egypt Great Again. Be provoked and be persuaded.